What do you think Nicholas II's biggest limitation was in his regime? Was it his capacities as a ruler, or was it the circumstances he was placed in terms of the time period?
Well, that's a great question. It goes directly back to the sort of issues we were just discussing about hindsight and how much we allow for the difficulties he faced at the time. I think you're certainly right in suggesting that by temperament, perhaps by education, he was unprepared for the responsibilities he took on against his expectations, because his father, Alexander III, died rather young. And he's famously known for sort of having burst into tears at the time and saying, how on earth am I going to rule Russia? I can't even talk to the ministers. He was a rather juvenile type who, even at the age of, 26, was still having sort of chestnut fights with various playmates. And probably by temperament was more suited to be a quiet country gentleman. He was deeply devoted to his wife and children. Probably found the whole business of trying to rule Russia, which his ideology and coronation oath told him he had to do directly, he probably found it all a little bit too much. And he sort of ended up by doing the worst of both worlds, by trying to imitate what his father had done by taking responsibility for everything, which meant that he sort of meddled in the minutiae of government without having real executive authority or any sort of clear policy direction. He didn't want to delegate, for example, nor did he show any real ability to coordinate the Council of Ministers. So he tried to keep the initiative by sort of divide and rule between his ministers, and so it was often said that the man with the most authority in Russia was the last minister to have spoken to the Tsar. And that meant also that jurisdictions overlapped, so that, for example, a sort of tussle developed between the Ministry of Interior, who was, which was generally more authoritarian in control of the police, and not wanting to release controls from government, and the Ministry of Finance, with Witte in particular, was much more liberal-minded. And that meant that there's a sort of element of bureaucratic confusion, even chaos develops under Nicholas II. But I think ultimately the limitations on his rule were rooted in his own ideology, that, as we've discussed before, he really believed that autocracy was a God-given way of government for Russia, that his authority derived from God, that he needn't take account of public opinion or have a government in any way accountable to society. And that, in an age of national newspapers, telegraph, of a dynamic society, increasingly literate, and a middle-class urban society with ideas of professional autonomy and constitutionalism, that in the modern age was just not up to the job. And so, the tragedy of Nicholas, in a sense, is that he was lumbered with an ideology and limited by his own political statesmanship and foresight, and perhaps even intelligence, to see that at some point, for the monarchy to survive, it would have to make concessions and transform itself into some sort of, if not constitutional system, then into some sort of parliamentary system where there was genuine accountability and where society could be included in the in government itself through the institutions of civil society, and more importantly through some sort of national assembly, arguably through a national Zemstva body as demanded in the 1890s, and then ultimately arguably through the Duma itself. And even that, you see, after 1905, Nicholas II wasn't, I think, genuinely committed to. on principle. So these are severe limitations, but going back to what we were discussing before, he had tremendous pressures on him, and there were many at the court, in the nobility, in the church, who didn't want Nicholas to reform. So we have to see that pressure on him, as well as perhaps judging him with the benefit of hindsight, knowing what was happening in Russia and where it was heading in a way that he might not have done.